The first one to hear the child cry was the old sorrel mare tied outside the mercantile. She lifted her head toward the alley just as the man in the white hat dragged the little girl through the dust and told her, in a voice smooth as a razor, that if she made one more sound, he'd give her a reason. That was all. One slow lift of his eyes from the bridle strap he was mending, and half the town of Bitter Creek went still because everybody there knew Elias Vale had not spoken a word in 10 years, and when a man like that paid attention, it meant something. He was tall, sun-cut, lean as winter fence wire, with a coat bleached pale by weather and a face that seemed carved into stillness rather than born to it. Folks said he had gone silent the same winter he buried his wife and little girl up beyond the cottonwoods. Folks said grief had hollowed him clean through. Folks said many things. Elias never corrected any of them. Before we go further, settle in wherever you are tonight, and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We always like knowing who's riding along with us. Then the girl twisted and bit the man's hand. He cursed, lost his grip, and she ran 2 stumbling steps toward the open street before he caught the back of her dress and jerked her so hard her knees hit the dirt. Still nobody moved. Not the barber in his doorway. Not the widow at the bakery window. Not Sheriff Pritchard, who stood at the end of the boardwalk with his thumbs in his belt and his courage nowhere useful. The man in the white hat was Vernon Pike, owner of the biggest cattle spread in the valley and holder of enough mortgages to make decent people flinch when he smiled. Elias set down the leather strap. Pike noticed. "This don't concern you, mute." Elias rose and stepped into the street. The alley breeze carried the smell of hot harness leather, horse sweat, and onions frying in the cafe kitchen. He stopped between Pike and the child. Pike flexed the hand she'd bitten. "She's mine by lawful papers. Her mama's sister died, owing me money. Debt came due. So did the girl." Elias did not move. The child peered around him, tear-streaked, braid half loose, one stocking fallen to her ankle. She looked up into the weathered face of the silent cowboy and asked, with the fearless desperation only frightened children possess, "Why won't you say anything?" Something changed in his eyes. Not weakness, recognition. Pike lunged to grab her again. Elias caught his wrist and bent it just enough to drop the big man halfway to his knees. No flourish. No show. Only clean, unhurried force. "Best let him go," Doc Mercer said softly from the boardwalk, startling everyone. Pike hissed, "Sheriff." Pritchard finally stepped forward. Sweat shone at his temples. "If there are papers," he said carefully, "they can be examined proper before any child is hauled away like stolen feed." Pike stared at him, furious that hesitation had entered the room where obedience normally lived. Elias released his wrist. Pike backed up, cradling his hand. "By sundown tomorrow," he said, glaring first at the sheriff and then at Elias. "The debt gets honored, or I collect what's mine my own way." He turned for the saloon, fury in every step. Only when he was gone did the street remember how to breathe. Mrs. Copley pushed open the bakery door. Flour marked both sleeves. "The child can sit in my kitchen till this is sorted." The girl clung tighter to Elias. Mrs. Copley softened. "Come on, lamb." The child shook her head. "I'm staying with him." Elias closed his eyes briefly. He could walk away. Any sensible man would. He had built 10 years of silence plank by plank. He had lived inside it like a cabin with no windows. He had asked nothing of the world except to be left alone inside the ruins of himself. Instead, he looked down at the girl. She stared back as if her whole future stood balanced on what he did next. Elias held out his hand. The child slipped her fingers into his palm. That was the moment the old life ended. They rode north under the long gold light of late afternoon, the girl sitting before him on the sorrel mare, while Bitter Creek shrank behind them into dust and gossip. Mrs. Copley had stuffed bread and cold ham into a cloth sack. Doc Mercer had sent a jar of salve for scraped knees. Sheriff Pritchard had promised to inspect Pike's papers by morning, but his face had looked like a man who already knew the law and justice were rarely stabled together. At the creek crossing, the girl said, "My name is Clara." Elias tapped his own chest, then drew a rough E with one finger on the saddle horn. She studied it. "Elias." He nodded. "I knew a man who got quiet after my mama died," Clara said. "But he wasn't quiet on purpose. He just coughed too much." His cabin stood in a pine clearing with a split-rail fence, a leaning chicken coop, and a woodshed stacked so neatly it looked measured. No smoke rose from the chimney. He had left that morning expecting no one when he returned. Clara turned in a slow circle after he helped her down. "It's lonely," she said, then frowned. "I don't mean bad lonely, just the kind that echoes." Inside, the place was plain, orderly, and too careful. A black stove, 2 shelves of books, a table scrubbed white at the corners, one bed behind a hanging quilt, one cot folded beneath the window. A cradle rocker stood in the corner with the kind of importance grief gives an ordinary object. Clara saw the rocker and then saw him see her seeing it. He lit the lamp. Kerosene caught. Warm amber light filled the room. He set out bread, ham, and water. Clara washed her face and hands in the basin, watching him the whole time. "Did you stop talking because you were sad?" she asked. His shoulders went still. He turned to the stove and laid kindling with careful fingers. After supper, he unfolded the cot, spread cedar-smelling blankets across it, and knelt to clean the scrape on her knee. She flinched, not from pain, but from the shock of being handled gently. "Mr. Pike says little girls are expensive," she said. "He says a body ought to be useful enough to cover the trouble it costs." Elias tied the bandage too tight, caught himself, then loosened it. She looked again at the rocker. "Did you have a little girl?" For a long moment he said nothing even with his face. Then he crossed to the mantel and brought back a small framed tintype. A dark-haired woman sat in a chair, proud and steady-eyed. Beside her stood a little girl of 5 or so holding a rag doll by one leg. The child had Elias's solemn gaze. Clara touched the frame with one finger. "They're dead." He nodded. "Both." He nodded again. "My mama too," Clara whispered. "Fever. She got hot, then cold, then gone." He returned the picture to the mantel, but Clara noticed how his thumb paused over the little girl's face. Later, when wind pushed at the cabin wall and made the door latch click, Clara startled upright from the cot. Elias checked the bar, checked the window, fed another stick to the fire, and settled into the chair beside the stove with a rifle across his knees. "Is Vernon Pike coming here?" she asked. Elias gave one short nod. "Are you scared of him?" He made a small seesaw motion with his hand. "A little." He nodded. Clara pulled the blanket up to her chin. "Mama used to say folks who ain't scared of nothing are either liars or fools." He lowered the lamp. At the edge of sleep she murmured, "If you ever do talk, I think you'll sound tired." That line stayed with him long after her breathing softened. He sat by the dying fire and listened to the mountain dark. Creek water over stone. Pine boughs rubbing together. The soft hitch in Clara's sleep whenever a dream turned rough. He had spent 10 years teaching himself not to want anything the world could take away. Yet one frightened child on a borrowed cot had already placed fear back inside him. And fear, he remembered, was only love with its coat off. By dawn he had made his choice twice more. First, he led his best horses out into the east meadow where they could not be stampeded in the night. Then he pried up the floorboard beneath his bed and took out the packet of papers he had not touched in 10 years. Clara found him at the table turning brittle documents in the window light. She could only read a little, but enough to make out a name. Nathaniel Pike, Vernon Pike's father. Elias tapped one page, then the survey map attached beneath it. Clara frowned. The map showed not only the cabin and the spring, but the north meadow and the lower grazing flats Pike currently used each summer. Her eyes widened. "That's your land." He nodded. "Not stolen all at once. Taken by signatures, grief, delay, and the hard knowledge that a man broken enough might not fight for what was his." He saddled the mare and a bay gelding and took Clara up to the ridge above the cabin. Bitter Creek lay small below. Pike's ranch spread wide and prosperous in the morning sun. Elias pointed west toward a line of cottonwoods near the abandoned stage road, where a crumbling stone station sat half hidden in weeds. By noon they were there, cool shadow around them, swallows nesting in the rafters. Elias worked loose an iron dispatch box trapped beneath fallen planks. Inside, wrapped in old oilcloth, lay ledgers, contracts, and a sheaf of letters preserved by dry air and luck. Clara crouched beside him. "You hid them." He shook his head, then tapped a letter addressed to Judge Abram Harlan and laid 2 fingers over the signature at the bottom. Ruth Vale, his wife. The realization moved through Clara slowly. She knew about the land. His jaw tightened. Whatever Ruth had known, whatever she had meant to send, death had broken the journey before the truth could reach the right hands. Hoofbeats sounded outside. Elias pulled Clara behind the broken wall, just as two of Pike's riders crossed the stage road below. "Sheriff says the mute's got the brat," one called. "Pike says bring her back and burn the cabin if he resists." The second rider spat into the weeds. "Always figured Vale for half dead anyway. Man don't talk for 10 years, he ain't all there." They rode off laughing. Elias waited until the hoofbeats faded, then rose with a face Clara would remember all her life. Not angry, past angry. The kind of calm that comes when grief is finally handed useful work. He tucked Ruth's letter into his coat. "Here is the question at the heart of it, and I'd love to hear what you'd have done. If the law had already bent once for a cruel man, would you still trust it? Or would you risk everything to stand between that child and the world trying to own her?" The storm began before they reached home. Not in the sky. The sky remained bright and pitiless. But 3 horses stood in the yard where no horses should have been, and one of Pike's men was kicking in the chicken coop while another splashed lamp oil against the woodshed wall. Elias shoved Clara behind the spring house and motioned for silence. The first shot split the afternoon. From behind the water trough, Elias's bullet knocked the oil can spinning through the dirt. Men shouted. One horse reared. Chickens burst into frantic noise. Everything after that moved fast. A rider cut left. Elias dropped to one knee and fired again. Saddle leather tore. The man pitched sideways and hit hard. The second ranch hand rushed the porch. Elias met him with the empty rifle, swinging it like an axe handle. Wood cracked against bone. The man folded. Then Vernon Pike stepped out of the cabin holding Ruth's rocker by one arm, as though considering where best to smash it. "There you are," he called, voice smooth as creek ice. "I wondered what it would take to make you fight. Turns out it's a stray child and a dead woman's furniture." Clara could see him through the gap beside the springhouse door. White hat, pearl-handled revolver, smile thin as wire. He had been inside the cabin. Inside the careful, quiet Elias had built to survive. That was the true violation of it. Pike lifted the revolver. "Bring me the girl and the papers, and I leave you the house. Refuse, and I take all 3 after I'm done teaching you what happens when drifters forget who owns a valley." Elias stood 10 paces away, rifle spent, blood already darkening one sleeve. It would have been easy to draw first. Easier still to kill Pike in the yard and let the valley tell itself whatever version of justice helped it sleep. But Pike wanted the killing private. He wanted the mute to die as he had lived, unheard. So Elias did the one thing Pike least expected. He stepped back into the open where anyone on the ridge could see him. Then he turned his face just enough for Clara to catch the meaning in it. Run. She understood because lonely children learn to read grown people the way other children read books. She crawled from the spring house through nettles and wet grass and broke for the ridge path. The bullet struck Elias high in the shoulder and spun him to one knee. Clara clapped both hands over her mouth to keep from crying out. Pike walked toward him with lazy victory in his stride. "Should have stayed buried with the rest of your ghost life." And then Doc Mercer's wagon burst from the north track with Sheriff Pritchard beside him and 3 townsmen hanging off the rear rail, each armed with whatever he trusted most. It was not rescue by chance. Clara would learn later that Elias had sent a note at dawn with the milk boy to Mrs. Copley naming the hour Pike's men would come if the sheriff failed him. Silent men, it turned out, could still find ways to be heard. Pritchard shouted for everyone to drop weapons. Pike fired at the wagon. Glass burst from the lantern bracket. One of the townsmen answered with a shotgun blast that shredded Pike's hat brim and sent his horse bolting. The world broke open into noise. Boots thudding. A mule screaming in harness. Men shouting. Clara sliding down the ridge so fast pine needles filled her stockings. She reached the yard just as Pike caught her by the arm with his good hand and jerked her against his chest. The revolver jammed hard to her temple. "Now," Pike said, panting. "Now we settle it. Drop the guns." No one moved. Blood ran down Elias's sleeve. His face had gone pale as ash, but he stepped forward anyway. Pike pressed the barrel tighter. "Hear me, mute." And there, with the whole valley narrowed to one child, one gun, and one ruined man refusing to fall, Clara looked at Elias through tears and asked again the question she had asked in town. "Why didn't you speak?" The answer came rough, as if each word had to claw its way through 10 buried winters. "Because when they died, if I opened my mouth, they weren't the only thing I'd lose." Every soul in the yard heard it. Even Pike flinched. Elias took another step. eyes on Clara. But I won't lose you. Clara bit Pike's hand again. He jerked. The gun shifted 1 inch. 1 inch was enough. Elias drew and fired. Pike's revolver spun from his grip. Clara dropped and rolled in the dust. Sheriff Pritchard hit Pike low. Doc Mercer came in from the side, with surprising fury for a man who smelled mostly of peppermints and camphor. Between them, they slammed Vernon Pike face first into the yard. The quiet after violence never arrives soft at first. It comes ringing, empty, full of broken breath. Clara crawled to Elias just as his knees gave way. He sank beside the trough, one hand in the dirt, and she threw herself around his neck with the blind force of a child who had been afraid too many times in one day. He made a sound that was not quite a word, only pain leaving the body, and his good arm came around her at once. Doc Mercer knelt by the wound. Bullet passed through. That's mercy. Sit still if you aim to keep the arm. Mrs. Copley appeared with boiled cloths and water. Half the town filled the yard behind her, their faces changed by what they had seen. A silent man breaking open his grief to save a child, and a powerful man finally in the dust where he belonged. Pritchard hauled Pike upright. Vernon Pike, you are under arrest for kidnapping, attempted arson, assault on a child, and fraudulent seizure of property pending review by the territorial judge. Pike spat blood and dirt. You got no proof of fraud. Clara looked at Elias. He looked back at her, then at the coat where Ruth's letter rested above his heart. That night the cabin filled with lamplight, bandages, soup, and the low sounds of people learning how to help. Doc Mercer stitched the shoulder. Mrs. Copley kept broth hot on the stove. Sheriff Pritchard sat at the table reading Ruth's letter again and again, growing angrier with each pass. She had documented forged boundary revisions Nathaniel Pike filed after the war, coercive debts used to swallow neighboring land, and Vernon's continued pressure after his father died. She had meant to ride the evidence to Judge Harlan herself in the spring. Instead, fever had taken Annie first, then Ruth within the same month, and Elias had become a man so shattered he let the world take whatever else it pleased. Clara sat wrapped in one of his blankets, watching him endure the needle without complaint. After a while, she carried the framed tintype from the shelf and held it out to him. You should keep them where you can see them. He looked from the picture to her face. Missing people don't come back because you hurt yourself enough, she said softly. My mama wouldn't have liked that either. Elias took the frame and set it on the table beside his hand. Clara climbed onto the stool opposite him. What were their names? He swallowed. The first name scraped on the way out. Ruth. Then, after a longer pause, Annie. Clara smiled her small solemn smile. They're pretty names. He looked at her bandaged knee, her torn hem, her fierce little jaw, and said in a voice still rough but steadier now, so is Clara. If this story is finding its way under your skin, you're the reason we tell them. A like and a subscribe helps us keep making room for the overlooked, the lonely, and the people who still believe goodness ought to win. Clara lowered her eyes. I thought you'd sound tired. A ghost of humor touched his mouth. I am. Justice took work. The kind that always comes after the dramatic part, when men sober up and paper matters more than fury. Judge Abram Harlan arrived 2 days later with a stiff back, a gray mustache, and a soul deeply inclined toward original documents with matching seals. He spent hours over ledgers, letters, and surveys while Vernon Pike sweated in the town cell. By sundown, the judge stepped onto the boardwalk and announced, before every soul in Bitter Creek, that Pike holdings north of town had been acquired through fraud spanning 2 decades. Those parcels, including the Valley grazing flats, were restored to the lawful Vale claim and its surviving interests. Then he added, with that special dryness judges use when they mean to wound a proud man publicly, that Vernon Pike would stand trial in Helena for abduction, coercion, assault, and attempted arson. Mrs. Copley started clapping. Doc Mercer joined in. Then the barber. Then the blacksmith's wife. One by one the whole street rang with it until Vernon Pike had to hear the sound of fear leaving town without him. Practical matters took longer. Boundaries were walked and marked. Debts were reviewed. 2 widows recovered grazing rights. Several families learned the mortgages strangling them had been illegally compounded. The first lawful cattle lease on the restored North Meadow sent money not into Pike's pocket, but into the schoolhouse roof and winter coal for families who needed it. Elias did not turn into a man of many words. That would have been false. Grief had shaped him, and love could not smooth him into somebody else overnight. But now he used words when he meant them, which turned out to be enough. He taught Clara how to read sign in creek mud, how to calm a nervous horse by placing a hand where the neck met the shoulder, and how to judge snow by the smell in the air. She taught him how to sit at supper without always looking like he expected loss to walk in through the door. She talked while shelling beans, folding laundry, and sweeping the porch, and little by little the cabin stopped echoing and started answering back. One evening, with autumn yellowing the creek bottoms, Clara found him mending the chicken coop Pike's men had wrecked. "Sheriff says the judge asked if you want to adopt me proper," she said. Elias set down the hammer. He had thought about it every waking hour. A man who had already buried a wife and daughter had every reason to fear calling anyone his again. But fear, he was learning, did not get final say merely because it was old. He crouched to meet her eyes. "Only if you want it to." She folded her arms, scandalized by the question. "I stayed, didn't I?" He laughed then. Rusty, brief, surprised as sunlight through storm cloud. Clara grinned. "There you are." He grew serious again. "I can't promise nothing bad ever comes." "I know. Can't promise I won't be scared." "I know that too." He looked toward the ridge where Ruth and Annie lay beneath the cottonwoods, then back to the child who had asked the one question no grown soul ever dared ask plainly. "I can promise," he said, slow and sure. "You won't face it alone." She stepped into him and wrapped her arms around his neck. "That's all I wanted." In the weeks that followed, Bitter Creek began acting like the kind of town it had once claimed to be. Men who had lowered their eyes when Pike passed now raised barns for families he had cheated. Mrs. Copley organized supper circles for widows once a week. Sheriff Pritchard, chastened and better for it, started enforcing the law as if rich and poor were made of the same material. Even the church bell sounded less lonely. When Pike's trial ended in Helena that November, the verdict came back guilty on every count worth naming. His remaining assets were seized for restitution. His reputation, once polished bright as a silver buckle, did not survive testimony from clerks, ranch hands, widows, and one small girl who sat straight-backed and told the court exactly how a man looks when he thinks a child can be owned. By first snow the adoption papers were signed. He read every line before putting his name beneath father or legal guardian. He paused only once, not from doubt, but from the weight of understanding what love asks of the living when the dead are still beloved. Then he signed. Months later, when spring greened the valley and snowmelt filled the creek, Elias took Clara up to the cottonwoods with fresh lilacs and the rag doll she had mended from scraps of Ruth's blue dress. Clara set the doll at Annie's grave and the lilacs at Ruth's. For the first time, Elias told the whole story aloud. Not elegantly, not like a preacher or a poet, just true. Ruth's laugh, Annie's stubbornness, the winter fever, the silence that followed, the child who had asked why and would not let grief be the last language left in the house. When he finished, Clara slipped her hand into his. "I think they'd like me," she said. He looked over the graves. The creek, the greening meadow returned at last to honest keeping. "They would," he answered. "Very much." Years later, people in Bitter Creek still told newcomers about the day the silent cowboy spoke. Some said the valley itself changed afterward, as if fear had been a weather pattern finally broken. What mattered was simpler. A man who believed speaking would finish destroying him learned that grief does not stay sacred just because it stays silent. And a child who had nearly been traded like livestock grew up in a house where every hard truth could be spoken by firelight and still leave room for supper after. On certain spring evenings, when the windows stood open and pine pitch drifted in with the dusk, Clara would read at the table while Elias mended tack nearby, and every so often one of them would look up just to make sure the other was still there. It turned out home was not the place where nothing could be lost. It was the place where what remained was loved enough to speak for. If you've ever known what it is to be overlooked until the very moment someone finally sees your worth, tell us in the comments. Those are the stories that bind people together across miles and quiet houses. In the last light beyond the cabin porch, the graves under the cottonwoods, the man on the step, and the girl laughing by the open window all belonged to the same soft gold, and the valley held them like something finally, completely put right.